Hi everyone, and welcome to the third and final part of a three-part lecture on qualitative research design. In this part we're going to focus on data analysis and ethics. Please feel free to skip through these intro slides. These materials are the result of a collaboration between Virginia or Ginny Braun on the left, myself, Victoria Clarke, in the middle, and Nikki Hayfield on the right. The lectures are narrated either by me or by Nikki, and as you can tell, because I'm speaking, I am narrating this lecture. To give you an overview of the topic of qualitative research design, what we will be covering in this lecture is understanding the different considerations that inform qualitative research design and understanding what constitutes robust and coherent qualitative research design. Throughout the lecture, there are a series of optional pauses for reflection where you can pause the audio recording and work through the questions or the activity on the slide. The various pauses for reflection in this lecture will take you through the process of designing a qualitative study, and they will also help you to reflect on the extent of your existing knowledge of the range and diversity of qualitative methods and help you to identify areas where you might need to do some more reading and learning. For a quick overview of the three parts of this lecture, we've already looked at design principles and research questions in part 1. In part 2, we looked at methods of data collection, sampling and recruitment. And then in this final part 3, we're going to focus on data analysis and ethics. For the first pause for reflection, we'd like to invite you to return to the qualitative research project that you've been planning and designing across the first two parts. This can either be a project that you're planning to conduct for your dissertation or thesis, or it can be a hypothetical project. And we'd like you to identify potential appropriate analytic approaches based on your existing knowledge and experience of qualitative data analysis, and select the approach that you think is most appropriate, or perhaps one that you feel most confident using for your project. Then we'd like you to reflect on why you think this approach is a good choice for your project, and if there's more than one version of your chosen approach. So take grounded theory, for example. There are endless different iterations of grounded theory, positivist versions, constructivist versions, and so on. If there are more than one version of your chosen approach, which version will you choose to use and why? Okay, so if you'd like to engage in this activity, pause the recording now. So what is qualitative analysis? How do we get from the binders full of hard copies of data in the picture at the top on the right hand side of the screen to a published paper in the picture on the bottom? And it's one of my papers that I think is called Unscripted and Improvised Public and Private Celebrations of Same-Sex Relationships. So the point of analysis is to organise and make sense of the data that you've collected at the most kind of simplest level. In a big Q framework, you're going to engage in interpretation, that your analysis is going to go beyond you merely acting as a mouthpiece for your participant, that you have to use your sense-making tools to make sense of the data, that your interpretation as a researcher, your interpretive skills as a researcher are part of this process, that you're not merely kind of excavating the truth of your data. So you're going to tell a story about your data, and that might involve demonstrating patterns across or within accounts from different participants. It might mean analysing and interpreting meaning. It might mean, in a more critical orientation, interrogating meaning. And it can also mean, in some approaches like grounded theory, developing a theory from your data. So there's lots of different purposes for qualitative analysis. There isn't kind of one thing that you do with qualitative data. Here are some of the different possibilities for qualitative data analysis, and this list of methods and methodologies is by no means exhaustive. And as well as an approach called something, let's take grounded theory for example, there isn't just one approach to grounded theory. There are multiple versions that have developed over the decades. So grounded theory is one of the older methods developed in the late 60s and early 1970s, and in the subsequent decades there are lots of different iterations of grounded theory that have developed. So we have thematic analysis and approaches like template analysis and framework analysis, and also qualitative content analysis. And these approaches are focused on identifying or generating themes across data. I say identifying or generating because this reflects different conceptualizations of the research process, either that you're discovering the themes that are in the data, or you as the researcher are actively crafting your themes. These methods can be seen as a family of methods, so thematic analysis isn't a singular approach, there are lots of different approaches. Some approaches like template and framework analysis have different names, but they're essentially forms of thematic analysis. Then we have grounded theory and all the different iterations of grounded theory. Grounded theory, as I said, has been around for quite a while. Originally developed in sociology, and there are now, as well as versions of full grounded theory where you develop a theory from qualitative data, there are abbreviated versions of grounded theory where you use grounded theory to develop categories and a sense of the relationship between them. There's even an approach called thematic coding, which uses grounded theory coding techniques to do a thematic analysis. So there's lots of kind of intersections and crossovers between these different approaches as well. Interpretive phenomenological analysis, a bit of a mouthful, so we call it IPA, an approach developed in psychology, and this combines a concern for themes, and analysis tends to be reported in the form of themes, but also ideography, a focus on the unique features of participants' accounts. So it sort of has a dual focus on the thematic, the across case, and the individual within a particular case. Then we have discourse analysis, and there are numerous different forms of discourse analysis. Different disciplines have given rise to different approaches, but even within psychology, for example, there are lots of different approaches. Discourse analysis is broadly a more critical method, looking at meaning construction and the rhetorical force and impacts of text and talk. So it offers something quite different from more experiential methods that are treating talk as more or less kind of reflecting participants' experiences, feelings, and so on. So interpretive phenomenological analysis, IPA, is an example of a more experiential approach. Discourse analysis, a more critical approach. Conversation analysis, that's another method that's been around for quite a while, developed in sociology and focused on the fine-grained detail of language practice. Quite a fascinating approach, often challenges our common sense assumptions about how conversation works. Narrative analysis has kind of elements in common with IPA, and in that it's focusing in depth on a single case or a small number of cases, and similar to discursive approaches, often has an interest in language and how kind of stories are constructed and the kind of structure of kind of narratives and storytelling. But these are just a few examples. There are many, many more approaches. Some approaches are very widely used, and in this list we've got some of the big hitters, the very popular approaches that have developed beyond their disciplinary origins and have become very widely taken up. And then there are lots of approaches that are more idiosyncratic, that are associated with a particular researcher and aren't particularly widely used. To help make sense of the different purposes of different approaches to qualitative analysis, Ginny Braun and Victoria Clarke have mapped out, it seems odd to talk about myself in the third person, but never mind, have mapped out sort of different ways of understanding the purpose of qualitative approaches to analysis. So we can classify approaches as focused on patterns of meaning across data items, and this probably captures most of the qualitative analytic approaches. So we can understand thematic analysis, template analysis, qualitative content analysis, grounded theory, IPA, and even some forms of discourse and narrative analysis as focused on generating patterns of meaning across data items. Then we can understand some approaches as oriented to understanding language practice, so what we as human beings do with language, how our choice of words, how our use of language performs particular functions and brings particular realities into being, and we would classify conversation analysis and some forms of discourse and narrative analysis under this heading of language practice. And then finally we have ideographic approaches that are focused on the specific details of individual accounts. So ideography can have some elements in common with language practice, and it can have some elements in common with patterns of meaning across data items, but instead the focus is on patterns of meaning within a single or a small number of data items. And IPA and narrative analysis both fit within the ideographic approach. So that gives you a brief sense of the different purposes of different qualitative approaches and how we might start to kind of classify and organise all the different methods that are on offer to us. Broadly speaking, we can divide all these different approaches into what we might call off-the-shelf or DIY methodologies. So many of these approaches, like IPA, grounded theory and discourse analysis, provide what Chamberlain calls off-the-shelf or ready-made methodologies that shape and delimit possibilities for different aspects of the research design. So your philosophical and theoretical assumptions, the types of research question you can ask, methods of data collection that are considered ideal or appropriate, sampling strategies, so how many participants you need and how you constitute the participant group, and of course your analytic procedures. So if you use one of these ready-made methodologies, you'll find that this is very influential in your research design because the method provides a wholesale theoretical framework for your research. So we call them methods, but we might be better off thinking of them as methodologies, as theoretically informed frameworks for research. Other approaches are closer to what we would call methods or tools and techniques. So approaches like thematic analysis and varieties of thematic analysis, like framework analysis and template analysis, and approaches like qualitative content analysis require considerable design thinking to implement. So we can think of these as requiring a DIY, a do-it-yourself methodology, where you have to make decisions about the philosophical and theoretical assumptions that will provide the foundations for your research. These methods can be very flexible when it comes to research questions and methods of data collection, and have very little prescriptions around how you constitute your participant group. So where they give us direction is around analytic procedures, but in relation to other aspects of research, they may be very, very flexible. So it's worth holding in mind this distinction and working out if the approach that you want to use is an off-the-shelf or ready-made methodology, or it's a method that invites you to create a DIY methodology. A question I'm often asked is whether we have to decide on an analytic approach at the start. And you may be surprised to hear that, well, it's something we need to think about and give considerable thought to, but it's not necessarily something that we have to be absolutely fixed on. And I'll go on to explain why on the next slide. Braun and Clarke invite us to abandon the hallowed method quest. What they mean by this is that there's rarely one ideal analytic approach for any given study, and that we shouldn't invest energy trying to figure out what that is. That if we look across all the different approaches that are available to us, there's often considerable overlap in what these different methods and methodologies can deliver, and the output of, say, a phenomenological TA and an IPA can look very, very similar. They also highlight that ready-made methodologies are not inherently superior. Sometimes this is an assumption that people can make, that these approaches are more credible, and therefore it's important that students use these approaches in their research. But this thinking is often based on problematic assumptions around approaches like TA, that TA is atheoretical. Instead, we need to think of an approach like TA as theoretically flexible. It's a method, not a methodology, and so we need to do the thinking, the conceptual thinking around the theoretical foundations for our use of TA. What we emphasise, myself and Ginny, is that you need to select a method or a methodology that fits the purpose of your project and that aligns with your theoretical assumptions, your research questions and your methods are also in alignment, and that the overall design is coherent. So this goes back to this general principle of fit, design coherence or methodological integrity that what's important is that you have a rationale for using the method that you've chosen, and that the approach that you've chosen is a good fit with your overall research design. It's not important that you identify the ideal method, because there probably isn't an ideal method. And going back to the question I asked when talking through the last slide, you might find when you collect your data that the method that you had in mind may not be the method that you want to use to analyse your data, and that's fine. What you're identifying at the planning stage is the sort of purpose of your analysis. So if we think back to that distinction between kind of identifying themes across cases or patterns of meaning more broadly, looking at language practice or looking at ideography, having a sense of your overall purpose at the design stage is what's important. Whether or not you're using TA or grounded theory is less important. Obviously, if you're using a methodology like grounded theory, you'll need to think about aspects of your research design so they're a good fit with grounded theory, but you might decide once you have your data that you want to shift your analytic approach, and that's okay. As long as there aren't significant ethical implications around doing that, that's really okay. One of the joys of qualitative research is that it's a flexible tool and our designs can evolve and change. So we'd like to invite you to pause for reflection again, and now we've talked through some of the wide range of possibilities for qualitative data analysis. You might like to think about whether there are any other methods or methodologies that might be suitable for your study that you might want to read up about and learn more about, and you might want to reflect on how the methods or methodology or methodologies that you've identified might shape and delimit your research design. So if you'd like to engage in this reflection, pause the recording now. It's obviously very important that we are ethical qualitative researchers, and the culmination of all your design thinking and planning will be laying out an ethical protocol for your research in an ethics application. So it's important to see ethics applications not just a bureaucratic hoop to jump through, then you can get on with the exciting business of doing your research. What you're doing when you're crafting an ethics application is laying out the protocol that you will follow when you're conducting your research. Your ethical practice will need to align with relevant ethics codes. In psychology, for example, that's the BPS Psychological Society's Code of Human Research Ethics, and there's a new version published in 2021. But as well as following these kind of written codes, you also need to be prepared to make on-the-spot ethical decisions. So it's very unlikely that your research will unfold exactly as you anticipate, that there may well be things that come up that you hadn't planned for, and you'll need to make kind of on-the-spot and spontaneous decisions. And this highlights and speaks to something the BPS reflected on in the 2014 version of the Ethics Code. The existence of lengthy, detailed and prescriptive professional or institutional regulations raises the risk of researchers following the letter but not the spirit of the regulations, and may in consequence lead to research being carried out that's ethically flawed. So what they're saying here is that, well, they're explaining the rationale for why the ethics code isn't a long list of do's and don'ts, but centres kind of principles that we need to reflect on and think about. But it's also about us embodying ethics and being able to make ethical decisions rather than simply kind of checkbox kind of following a list of rules and regulations. So this is something really important to kind of hold in mind, is that you may need to make some spontaneous decisions. You may have the opportunity to consult with your supervisor and get their advice, and you may need to make an amendment to your ethics protocol as well. Reflection, we'd like to invite you to reflect on the ethical issues that you'll need to take into account in relation to conducting your research and what ethical procedures you will be used. We'd also invite you to reflect on whether your study raises any particular ethical issues, and we've got some examples here for you to think about, but this isn't an exhaustive list. There might be other examples that you want to think about. If you're conducting research online, you'll need to think about ethics codes around online research. So the Association for Internet Researchers have their own ethics code. The British Psychological Society has an ethics code for what it calls internet mediated research. If you're recruiting participants who could be considered vulnerable in any way, children or elderly adults with dementia who lack decision-making capacity, then you need to give extra thought to how you will protect these participants. Dual relationships or multiple relationships is something that we see in ethics applications. Students often don't think about. So dual relationships are where you have a relationship with the participant as the researcher, but you also have some other kind of relationship with them. So if you're doing research in your workplace, you'll have a collegiate relationship with someone and you'll have a researcher-participant relationship. And so you need to think about the boundaries between those two relationships, how you keep them separate, and how you avoid exploiting your kind of pre-existing relationship in relation to the research. You also need to think about the potential use of findings. So this is where ethics codes have shifted away from just focusing on the process of doing research to focusing on the outcomes of research. Is there any potential for your findings to do harm to the participants that you've spoken to the community that they're part of? You'll also need to think about anonymity and confidentiality. Even if this isn't something participants seem to be concerned about, it's something you need to be concerned about, and how you will protect participants' anonymity. And this is obviously more challenging in qualitative research, where we have people's actual words, where we might have recordings of their voices or even video recordings of them talking to us. Another important thing to think about is whether you're an insider or an outsider researcher. So you're a member of the group that you're studying, an insider, or are you not a member of the group? Obviously this is quite a binary way of thinking about this, and we can be insiders and outsiders at the same time in all kinds of different ways, but it's a useful tool for thinking about our relationship to our participant group and the community that we're conducting research with, and how this might shape how we interact with the participant group. If we're an insider, this might build trust, but then there could also be potential for exploitation. We also need to think about what's called representing the other. And this is about being an outsider researcher representing or researching a participant group who can be considered socially marginalised or minoritised. So socially we exist in a power relationship with the participant group, and we need to think carefully about the stories we tell about that participant group. I always hold the activist slogan, nothing without us, about us, in mind here, to think through the ethics of representing the other. We also need to think about our own safety as researchers, both physical safety but also psychological and emotional safety. If we're doing research on very sensitive topics or with participants who are sharing traumatic experiences, it can be really tough and challenging to read the data and sit with the data. And so we need to have strategies to protect ourselves, which might include things like keeping a research journal and using supervision to offload. And we also need to reflect on how we show respect for difference. So one of the BPS ethical principles is respect, and as part of that is respect for difference, how we go about conducting research in an inclusive way. And this is something that we'll talk about more in the next slide. So if you'd like to engage in this activity, please pause the recording now. I now wanted to briefly highlight the importance of doing non-discriminatory research in relation to the BPS principle of respect for difference. Obviously, research isn't a value-neutral activity, that our lives are full of values and assumptions, and these can permeate our research and lead to discriminatory research, as well as research that confirms negative viewpoints. So historically in psychology there was a controversial linking of race and IQ. Research can be discriminatory when the practice or the reporting of it contains assumptions which implicitly exclude certain categories of people, and this contributes to their further marginalisation within society. And this can happen in quite subtle ways. So when you're planning your research and conducting your research, you need to think carefully about how your design, your practices, your interpretations and presentations can be potentially and unintentionally discriminatory, and how they can be made non-discriminatory. So let's consider an example. Imagine you want to do research on couples' experiences of becoming parents. You need to think about, what is your research about? Straight couples? Is it about lesbian gay couples? Is it about all couples? You need to be clear about what couples you want to hear from in your recruitment materials. And if you just want to focus on straight couples, you need to be explicit about this. Ditto if you just want to focus on lesbian and gay couples. Because we live in a heteronormative society where couple often refers to or is interpreted as straight couples, if you recruit generically, you may implicitly exclude lesbian and gay couples. They might assume that it's lesbian and gay couples that you want and so not volunteer. So if you want any type of couple, it's important to make this explicit. And if you are focusing on straight couples, you need to avoid heterosexism in how you report and interpret your results. So think about the following two statements. Traditional gender roles become more salient for couples once they are parents. Some heteronormativity there. Traditional gender roles become more salient for heterosexual couples once they're parents. So how you report matters. So all this means that you need to think carefully about who you want to speak to, and you can't assume that just by being inclusive in your wording that people will understand that the research is relevant for them. That if you want to speak to groups who are socially minoritized, you need to be explicit about wanting their contribution to their research. And you also need to reflect on your own positioning. So for example, as a white woman, when I've supervised research on the experiences of black women, we've made it really explicit in the participant-facing materials that I'm a white woman. And this feels important to establish trust with participants, that as a white person I have an awareness that I'm white, and I have an awareness that I belong to a socially privileged group. So as well as thinking about who you want to speak to, you also need to think about your own positioning and what you communicate about that to participants. The activist slogan, "Nothing about us without us," I think is really useful to think about here and to reflect on the kind of research that we do. And in some circumstances it can be appropriate for people who aren't members of a particular group to do research with that group, but in other circumstances it might not be appropriate. So I always have that slogan, "Nothing about us without us," in my head when I'm thinking about the appropriateness of research that I'm designing. So the idea that we might need to be quite specific if we want to recruit particular communities and groups of participants to take part in our research relates to the idea of the distinction between equality and equity. So equality is where we treat people the same, what's sometimes referred to as an equality of inputs. And equity is where we acknowledge that we might need to treat people differently in order to ensure an equality of outputs, in order to ensure a similar outcome for people. So it's worth holding that distinction in mind when we're thinking about doing non-discriminatory research. It doesn't necessarily mean that we have to treat all our participants the same. We might need to treat participants differently in order to ensure an equality of outputs or equity. So for psychologists like myself, Ginny and Nikki, that we need to think about knowledge as relating to a true psychology of people, that in the past psychology has often focused on particular groups. I've talked about the usual suspects in the past and presented knowledge based on the experiences of these particular, often privileged groups as relevant to all people. But engaging in non-discriminatory research is about developing, for us as psychologists, a true psychology of people, that we're understanding the range and diversity of human experience rather than just focusing on a particular privileged group of people and claiming that this tells us about everyone's experiences. We also need to think about individual and group well-being and the fact that we can potentially collude in doing harm to already marginalised groups if we engage in discriminatory research. So doing non-discriminatory research is really important. Ethically, it's important to ensure that we respect difference in meaningful ways. We're going to end with a couple of pauses for reflection. In this pause for reflection, we'd like you to think about reflexivity and the distinction that Sue Wilkinson makes between personal and functional reflexivity. Personal reflexivity relates to the researcher, your positioning. Functional reflexivity relates to your choice of methods. We cover this in more detail in Foundations of Qualitative Research too. So if you return to the qualitative study, the either real one you're going to do or the hypothetical one you've been planning throughout this lecture, think about whether or not you have a personal interest or personal investment in your research topic, and whether or not any aspects of your identity will be implicated in the recruitment of participants and the processes of data collection and analysis. So this is your personal reflexivity. For your functional reflexivity, we invite you to reflect on how the methods you've chosen to collect and analyse your data might shape your analysis, might shape your findings. So if you'd like to engage in this activity, pause the recording now. So one final pause for reflection. We'd like to invite you to write a timetable for your qualitative study. This might seem a bit scary and make it a bit real, but if you think about the time you have available for conducting your research, planning out your time is really useful. And you're not planning a sort of rigid timeline that you have to stick to. You're going to acknowledge that things might change, but it's useful to give you a sense of how much time you need for different elements of the process, and to give yourself a sense of where you are in the process, because it can feel like an enormously big challenge, and so breaking it down into smaller chunks can be really helpful. So allow time for planning your research and for ethical approval. Allow time for supervisor feedback. This is something that I find students often miss out in their timelines, that they're going to give me their research for feedback and I'll do it on the same day. Allow your supervisor a couple of weeks or however long they need to kind of turn around feedback. And try to allow time for problems and challenges. Some research goes fairly smoothly, but in most research there'll be some small problems and challenges that you have to navigate, and sometimes there can be bigger challenges as well. So if you can kind of plan in this and anticipate it, it means the whole thing is less stressful. And try to allow at least a third or a half of the time that you have available for your data analysis. This is in a qualitative project where you really need plenty of time to reflect, to put it down, to walk away, to come back again. You don't want it kind of squeezed into a small tight window. So work out how much time you have to complete your research, and then plot out the different elements of the process and put together a draft timeline. So if you'd like to engage in this activity, pause the recording now. Here are the references for part 3, and this is the end of this 3-part lecture on qualitative research design. We hope you found it useful and you're feeling a bit more confident about planning and designing a qualitative project.